Okay, good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm delighted to welcome this evening's speaker from Portugal. Gerald Luckhurst is a landscape architect who qualified in the US and the UK before falling in love with Portugal, thanks to a fellow landscape architect who was a student with him called Teresa Anderson, and falling in love with historic gardens, particularly thanks to his professor, the garden historian, Christopher Thacker. He moved to Portugal in the mid-80s and took his first job there at the Monserrate. I'm sorry if the pronunciation is...
Monserrate.
You will put us right. For the princely sum of £200. Later, he founded his own landscape garden, which today employs 50 people. And it is involved with design, building, supply of plants, and the maintenance of gardens for public spaces, hotels, and private estates in Portugal, Madeira, and elsewhere. He's very particularly proud of his long, fruitful relationships with both staff and clients who tend to stay loyal to him over the duration of their career sometimes, and also when moving from one house to the other, or from one project to another. His work on the preservation and conservation of historic landscapes has garnered awards, and he has written widely about the history of Portuguese gardens, including books and articles on the 3 gardens that we will hear about this evening, of which he writes, "All cultural landscapes change over time, but there are some gardens that survive, and they do so through their own continued significance and distinctive character. There are places that show signs of immortality. Their beauty is deeply ingrained. It saturates the air and shines through the trees. These are 3 such gardens." I loved that. I thought that was very beautifully written. We're very lucky to have you tonight as our guide on our virtual visit this evening, and I thank you a lot very much for agreeing to talk to us, Gerald. A very big welcome to you. If you'd like to share your screen now, I'm sorry.
Okay, let's see if we get this right.
Okay.
Now then, I just have to hide this.
There you go. Perfect.
Okay, I think we're all set.
Yes, I can see the opening slide. Perfect.
The opening slide. So
thank you.
This is me at Monserrate. And this, I think this part of the garden at least would qualify as a Mediterranean garden. Sintra has an interesting climate because it's more like northern Portugal than central Portugal, where it is. It's very close to Lisbon. I'll show you that in a moment. So we get long, dry, hot summers and short, warm, wet winters. And some parts of the garden, Monserrate is a very large garden, and 90% of it is not watered. The only regular watered areas are the large lawns. And there's one particular garden called the Fern Valley, which is on a north-facing slope. But in order to keep it looking good, it gets watered from a stream that passes through the middle of it. So in Portugal, we like to think of our climate as somewhat more Atlantic than Mediterranean, but it's getting more and more Mediterranean as time goes by, with the winters getting drier and the summers getting hotter. So let's start. So we're talking three gardens that I've been involved with since the mid-1980s. And let me change the slide and we can move on. That's the moment. That's interesting. Ah, good. So for those of you who don't know, Sintra is in Portugal, as we've heard. It's very close to Lisbon, and it's more or less on the same latitude as Rome, I suppose. The country runs from north to south. The biggest climatic influence is, as I said, the Atlantic, and the winds that bring the moisture generally come from that direction. But as you travel from north to south in Portugal, the climate changes quite dramatically. So in northern Portugal, it's very much equivalent to southwest of England, Cornwall, Devon and Cornwall, Brittany, and you get that corner of Spain, Galicia, where they grow fabulous camellias and rhododendrons. But as you move further south, it gets drier. And at the bottom, there's the Algarve, which paradoxically is the most active area of gardening in Portugal, but that's because there's so many foreigners live there. It's all attached to a hose pipe, very much. There, fortunately, nowadays, a great many people in Portugal who are looking for water-wise gardens, and let's hope it continues to this trend. As I say, in Sintra, most of the gardens are not watered. There's, as you can see from these photographs, a quite persistent mist that comes in from the sea, and so through the summer months, there's still a millimeter or so of rain coming in every day from humid clouds and mist. So let's see if I can get this to work this time. No, that's the wrong way. Okay. So the three gardens are a Monserrate. Can you read the date there? It's behind the picture of Angela on my screen. I can't hear you, Angela.
Yes, it's fine.
It's
okay.
Fine, yeah.
Okay.
And
so,
maybe, Gerald, can I just interrupt you?
Yes,
maybe you need to change your view. If you're seeing me, you don't want to have me in your screen, I think. Can you go up to the top of
I've got you. Okay, it's gone. Yes.
Good. Okay.
You're gone. Okay. So three gardens: Monserrate, Regaleira and Queluz. And I've worked with all these gardens since the 1980s, but they've all gone through various different political situations, and Monserrate and Queluz are now run by an organization which is a government-owned company called Parques de Sintra, who've been tremendously successful in restoring the historic gardens of Sintra. And Regaleira, which belongs to a foundation, it's actually a municipal foundation. But I was sort of involved in setting up these organizations, certainly Parques de Sintra, and worked with Fundação de Cultura Sintra since its inception. But I started at Regaleira. It was still a private house, and then it went through a period where it belonged to a Japanese corporation. But this is the actual management structure today. Oop, I'm going to get this right in a minute. So I'll start with Monserrate. This is a fairly recent photograph. One of the things that we did was remove a tremendous amount of invasive trees. And if you see this poor oak tree here, it's only half a tree, because everything to the left of it was invasive trees. It was a forest of acacias. And the tree never did recover. It's always been on my list to remove this tree, but because it's an oak, nobody agrees with me. And interestingly, the new ground modeling and restored lawn is full of daisies, and the old lawn doesn't have any daisies in it. I don't know why. So here's a map of Portugal with the location near to Lisbon. And then there's a UNESCO World Heritage Landscape, which is the cultural landscape of Sintra, of which Monserrate is part. So I worked at Monserrate from 1985 to around about 2015. I'm no longer directly involved, other than through the Friends of Monserrate. So this is the map that we hand out to tourists, give you an idea of the extent of the garden. It's 33 hectares, which is about 75 acres. And it's really, they love to call it a park, but it's not a park. It's a series of gardens built within a native woodland. So all this surrounding vegetation is cork oaks and bay laurels and viburnum tinus and other species. I think there are about 7 different species of oaks, some deciduous, some are evergreen. And then there are different gardens within the area. So there's a big lawn, which dates from the 18th century. There's a tree fern valley from the 1870s, the Mexican garden, a rose garden, a palm garden here, and another palm garden over here. So the visitors generally get lost in this garden, which is a wonderful feeling. And although it gets its fair share of tourists, they nearly all just come down the hill, go and see the palace and go to the cafe and go home. And so if you ever visit the garden, you have to find your way down to the bottom of Mexico. And you really can be quite lucky and feel as if you're the only person. So that's a picture of what the garden looks like today. I thought I'd better show you this first because I'm about to show you some pictures of what it looked like when we first started. So we set up a scheme. I was working as a consultant to the municipality of Sintra, and we managed to obtain funding from Canada through the Royal Botanic Gardens of Hamilton, Ontario. And that got the scheme off the ground. We were working from 85. By 87, we were actually up and running. So these photographs are probably from that period. This was the entrance gate, and here it says the park is closed. This is very amusing for me to look at now because I don't see these photographs very often. And this is my guys coming from Canada and also Portuguese landscape architects, and we had a team of 20 trainee gardeners, but these were the Canadian landscape architects and horticulturists that came to work. And we were very keen and didn't have great resources or a huge amount of machinery, but we set to it and we used to liken it to waking the sleeping beauty. And here in 98, this young lad here is me. It's, I'd just finished my first 3 professional years in London, which were required to get our landscape architect's license. And then as soon as I got that, I left and came to Portugal. I've never had a job since, actually. So this is the report we put together. We were very ambitious. We thought we'd put a 5-year plan to recover the different areas of the garden. It ended up taking 30, but here we go. So it's just some of the ideas. This is an interesting pair of photographs. If you look very carefully, you can see a pilaster here. And that pilaster is this pilaster. So this was a neo-Gothic folly built in the 1790s that had disappeared. And it was actually a sort of eye-catcher. And by removing some of the vegetation, it was actually completely covered in ivy as well. Unfortunately, I left this cork tree here, which I should have taken out, because nowadays it occupies all this space here and the views disappeared again. Cork trees are protected trees in Portugal, the cork oak. So as we were getting into the garden in a very practical manner, we were also working on the historic research. And the first results of that research was published in 1988 in this book, Sintra, A Landscape with Villas. And some of the information came from some of the English owners that owned Monserrate for 4 generations, called the Cooks. And Lady Brenda Cook, or Brenda Lady Cook, I should say, lived in Jersey, and I went to visit her, and she produced this wonderful architectural drawing and photographs of her families, her ancestors, her husband's ancestors, and their friends. So the history of Monserrate goes back to 1790, but in fact, I think it's earlier. The official history is 1790, but it goes back into the 1780s. And it was originally built by this chap here, who is Gerald de Vim. He was a Huguenot, Protestant exile, born in London. He was trained as a merchant and came to Portugal and eventually became one of Portugal's richest men and a banker to the royal family. He built 4 houses and gardens, one of which was Monserrate. And this is a very simple drawing of what he made. I like to classify it as a fair Monet. It's a garden space, but it's full of orchards and vineyards, and there are even some of the drawings there are sheep. So it's an ornamental farm. Beckford came along later. So 1790 was when the house was finished. De Vim never actually lived in the house and left in 1791. And Beckford was visiting Portugal at the time of the house's construction. And he decided to rent the house. This is William Beckford, the writer. He's a wonderful travel writer, famous for his Gothic novel, Vathek, and his house, the Fonthill Abbey, which in its day was the tallest building in England. Only it didn't last very long, as you can see. It fell down. And Beckford was a regular visitor to Portugal during the 1790s, but his last visit was in 1799. Monserrate was abandoned, and later Napoleonic troops invaded Portugal in 1807. And so they came in, they looted all the convents. Wellington came and kicked them out. There was a convention. The British Royal Navy took them home with all their gold and all their money, and John Bull wasn't very happy. They also wrecked Monserrate. After the French, in 1809, Monserrate was visited by its most famous tourist, Lord Byron. And he wrote in the poem and made Monserrate and its ruin a famous destination for the Victorian Grand Tour. This is some of the some images from that period. So the house is already beginning to fall to pieces. That's that eye catcher we saw just earlier. And this gentleman turned up and he bought Monserrate. This is Francis Cook. He was a very wealthy textile merchant and an art collector. And once he bought Monserrate, he became a plant collector as well. His family stayed at Monserrate, and they finally sold Monserrate in 1946. So there were 4 generations. He was made a baronet, and in Portugal a viscount. And the family is still there, and they still come to visit us at Monserrate. And that's what the house looked like when he bought it. So just the Gothic structure, no windows, no doors, no roof. And this is what his architect imagined for him, taking on the original structure and applying a decorative veneer in as many styles as you can possibly imagine. That's one of the earliest, if not the earliest, no, it's not the earliest, but it's one of the earliest photographs of Monserrate. You see the house is completed, 1869, and they've started planting, but not with a great deal of design. They've got the old lawn and they plonked conifers in the middle of it. They took a while to sort of settle down to their ideas of how they were going to develop the garden. And one of the men that helped Francis Cook develop the garden is Cargill, John Cargill, who was a bit bonkers. claimed to receive his inspiration from his ancestor. Here he is hovering over him in the photograph. And he wrote this poem, 300 pages long, describing the garden and how it was developed. It was, I'm sure I'm the only person who's ever read it. Now I'd just like to show you some images of the garden as it was in the time of the Cooks. The other gardens I'm going to show you, I did extensive work in archives. And in Monserrate, the archive was sold in 1946. And despite a great many people having looked for it, it hasn't turned up. And so we're still waiting to find the archives. But what I did was collected as much information about the garden as possible, and many engravings from the early period, photographs, illustrated postcards, but also because of Byron, Monserrate, right from the early days, was a tourist destination, and everybody who came to Portugal came to Sintra. Everybody who came to Sintra came to Monserrate, and they all seemed to write a book about it. And so we had a really rich array of descriptions and images from which to reconsider the garden. This is the Fern Valley. These are photographs from the early 19th century. Sorry, early 1900s. An area around the house. And then there's this garden called Mexico. These are early stereoscopic views. You can see that they're in pairs. And, you know, Monserrate, the climate of Monserrate was described by visiting botanists as a glass house without a roof. So it has a really fantastic, very mild climate. And things grow very, very fast. These are the lakes at the bottom of the lawn. Here's the lawn here. And there's a stream that runs through the garden, which is fed by 3 artificial reservoirs. And these reservoirs are fed by 75 natural springs. So there's a lot of water. All this work on the Monserrate garden was the basis of my PhD, and this book was going to be published around about the time COVID arrived, and we're just getting it back on the press at the moment. So this is a book that's based on my doctorate. I'll just show you some specific parts of the garden. So this is Mexico, and some of the illustrations from the Canadians' reports. It's difficult to see that it really was not seeing for the wood for the trees. You can see it's very overgrown. This before and after here. This is the after of the lake at the bottom of the lawn that was dug out, and this is part of Mexico. Here's Mexico. It's still out in the garden. Okay, so this is the present day Mexico. It was inaugurated in 2010. We had a wonderful time making this garden, and we were closely associated with the Mexican embassy. All of these things were planted in really quite small sizes, and then proceeded to grow very, very fast. This is the bottom of Mexico in the year it was inaugurated. These are our African marigolds, tagetes, which of course are Mexican. They're called cempasúchil, and it's this flower they use to celebrate the Day of the Dead. And for years afterwards, I was invited to the Mexican embassy for their wonderful Day of the Dead parties. on the back of the fact that I would supply them with vast quantities of these flowers. And if the weather in Sintra failed, I would fly them in from my gardens in Madeira. Also see sunflowers, they're also Mexican plants. And these are Forcreas. And then I slipped in a couple of cycads that of course are not Mexican. But the excuse is that the bottom part of the garden in the 1920s became a tropical garden. It was no longer considered the Mexican garden. And this is all planted. This photograph is from 2013, I think, but we finished planting in 2010. And this is a view at a different season. The Mexican salvias, which have become so popular in gardens, are fabulous plants in Sintra. They flower. They've just started flowering now, and they'll go till Christmas. So this is that part of the garden that's considered the tropical garden with palm trees. But you can see, look at the size of this yucca. It's appropriately yucky gigantea. And we planted 100 species of agaves. Not all of them survived, but those that did have done extremely well. This is one of my favorites, Franzosini. And with lots of aeoniums. Unfortunately, I bought seed from a German plant collector who obtained them mostly from the Canary Islands. And we raised them in the greenhouse, and my head gardener was very proud of them. And I said to him, whatever you do, make sure you only plant one species in every bed, because we'll never learn their names. Of course, he mixed them all up, and to this day, I have no idea what species which is which. Some of them I can get there, they're easier than others. The Mexican garden, even in Francis Cook's day, contained other collections. So there were also plants from the Canary Islands, and one of the significant trees is the dragon tree, just Dracaena dracu, which I've grown a lot of these plants in desert islands, and they grow very slowly. But we planted them here. This is a fairly recent photograph. So we're talking about maybe 10 years old now. But you see that scar there, that was where the dragon tree was planted. And they generally take about 15 years to flower, but the dragon trees here, they started flowering after about 5 or 6. And my ambition is that they will grow together and form a cathedral space, and all the aeoniums will probably have to be shaded out. More Atlantic Islanders. This is the Pride of Madeira. This is wild Pretii from Canary Islands. This is for many years was my boss, the director of the green spaces at Parques de Sintra, and he was particularly proud of this one. Oops, that just escaped me. And then South African plants too, and a Portuguese lizard. They love the Mexican garden. And this is where the Mexican garden, South African style, is beginning to merge with the palm collection. So we've got old palms here and young palms that have been recently planted. That's another pathway through the Mexican garden. And that's the inauguration party. We had 500 people on the lawn with a mariachi band and tequila and margaritas. It was a wonderful way to start a garden. Another area, the Fern Valley, is perhaps nowadays the garden that gives me the most pleasure. And it's really, really picturesque. This is a photograph taken at the beginning of the autumn, when the autumn rains have come. This is an adicium from the Himalayas. And these are the tree ferns. So none of this existed. It's all new planting. All of this is new planting. There's an old one there. That's an old plant. These are new. And this is quite an old photograph. These are now they've got trunks as tall as me, these young plants. That's the eye catcher, and these are Madeira geraniums that have done very well in this garden. Okay, it's just some other plants that we've planted because the Fern Valley, all the descriptions talked about how it was full of flowering plants as well. And then at the bottom of the lawn, the ornamental lakes. This is just a mirror image. That's there. And for 3 years running, we grew the Victoria in the Longwood hybrid in the outdoors without any artificial heat. We raised the seed in the winter in the greenhouse and then planted them up. And this is a great South African plant, which has become popular now, but used to be very unusual, Wachendorfia. And that's the garden in the rain. The rhododendron collection at Monserrate began with plants imported from Kew, and it was the Sikkim rhododendron collection of the Hookers. Hooker was an active participant in the building up the plant collection of Monserrate. There were lots of modern hybrids as well, of course. And just quickly now, the Rose Garden. This is a project by the Friends of Monserrate, which is an organization that I've belonged to since the beginning. We're more than 25 years old now. And this was our group of friends laying out the bones of the Rose Garden, and me teaching people how to grow cuttings. You see, these ladies can't figure out which way up it should be. Lots of Himalayan gigantea hybrids because they grow so well here in Portugal. And the idea was to go back to that Sleeping Beauty idea a bit, to have this massive banks of roses. Louis XIV didn't last very long. It was too small. This one grows very well. It's William Allen Richardson. And another gigantea. This is a modern hybrid from India, from a friend of mine, that when he came to visit me, he was the breeder, and he says he's never seen his roses grow like they do at Monserrate. This is an Australian gigantea hybrid, and more tea roses. And this one, of course, this was very important. We had to have a Duchess of Portugal, Duchess of Cornwall, because we also planted a Prince Charles, because our rose garden was inaugurated by their Royal Highnesses, now, of course, King Charles III. In 2013, Monserrate was awarded the European Garden Award for the best garden restoration in Europe in the year of 2013. So we're very pleased to have this recognition, and it's a great scheme, this European Garden Award, and you should, if you look up their site, you'll find many gardens that are well worth visiting. So moving on to the next garden, and I'm going to have to speed up a bit now. This is Regaleira. Regaleira is a garden that dates from 1840, but it was reimagined from 1898. And I'll tell you a little bit about the story, but it's become incredibly famous because people write many, many books about how the garden is full of symbols, and in particularly, it's considered to be a Freemasonic garden. My point of view is completely opposite to that, and I'll explain briefly why. So it's a very, very pretty garden, beautiful plantings. A lot of the planting was actually done later in the 1950s, and it really takes advantage of its scenic position in Sintra and the growing conditions. tree ferns. These are old plants from the 1950s, and these are young plants planted by me. And these days they're more or less the same size. You can see again that mist and the humidity, and lots of moss. Regaleira has a subterranean garden. There are all sorts of mysterious openings like this one. It has a model farm, and these are all the agricultural buildings. And this was some planting that I did back in about the year 2000. It's still going strong. You see some more of those Madeira geraniums. And the garden is full of statues and urns and architecture, and this is where people who like to have a rich imagination write all sorts of books, try and explain it to you. And this is one area which they call the Terrace of the Gods. And many people have written the significance of the order of these statues. In the 1950s, I know for a fact that the owner at that time had them mixed up because he was fed up with people writing the stories, and they're still going on. In fact, these statues, this one, she's not a goddess at all. She's spring, and this is winter, and this is autumn. And so actually it was just a job lot of statues that was bought from another garden and brought in about the early 20th century. But as you move around the garden, there's so many different features, and all of it has definitely has lots of symbols, but they're actually meaningless. This is the only one that means anything. This is something from the 18th century. It used to belong to the church, this garden, and it had a via sacra. So this is the 14th station of the via sacra. There was an old greenhouse that was falling to pieces. There are all sorts of underground grottos. And there's even a tower, which is 9 stories high, that descends into the earth and leads to more and more tunnels. And then there's another tower that goes the opposite direction. So 1840, this lady, the Baroness Regaleira, began the estate. But the man that really set the place on the map was bought in 1892 by Antonio Augusto Carvalho Monteiro. He was probably the richest man in Portugal of his day. He owned, amongst other things, diamond mines in Brazil. And this is the extraordinary man that designed Regaleira. He, an Italian architect, originally trained as a set designer at La Scala, the Brera Academy. So nobody knew anything about Manini, and I put it upon myself in conjunction with Denise Breda, who was the director of Regaleira. We tried to find out something about it, and it wasn't until I stumbled upon this book, which was in a bookshop in New York, that things really took off. And the book contained a description, 9 pages of Manini's work, particularly as a painter, but also as an architect, and gave us a clue. It said that his paintings were in the Civic Museum of Crema. And so we went to visit the garden at the museum. We found his paintings. These are some of Manini's paintings, but we also found some of his drawings. And in fact, there was a collection of his archives that had been at the museum since 1925, and nobody had studied them. This is just a few of the things that came from that collection. And we spent 7 years cataloging and studying this collection. It led us to many other directions, and we found his descendants and collectors who owned his works, and this eventually was produced to international exhibitions. If you're interested, the Lombardy Cultural Services have all these drawings that we catalogued. They're all available online. You can see there were 821 items in this particular search. Manini was a set designer, and he painted the actual backcloths that were used in the operatic productions. But all of these things were designed on small bozzetti. This is like an A3 drawing watercolor, and they were passed on from one set designer to another using this medium. This is Manini. He meets Carvalho Monteiro on the train one day, and they get together, and he decides to design. Carvalho Monteiro invites him to design his palace, and this is it. This is the Regaleira house, just newly finished. It's in a style of many different styles, but some of it is identified as the Portuguese national style manual line. So this is generally called neo-manual line architecture. That's one of Manini's own photographs of the garden. You can see they were busy planting things up, and maybe a lot of stuff in pots. This is mostly just orchards and a lot of woodland. So in fact, the garden, the horticultural part of the garden never really got finished. But the architectural building took 14 years to build. And in this archive, which was completely unknown, we found 500 drawings of Regaleira alone, and identified maybe 40 projects that Manini had worked on in his lifetime. So here's different drawings of the same item. That piece there is this piece here. This is another pair of towers. Here's the present-day condition. These towers were belvederes, and you could see fabulous views. And my one regret in working in this garden is they never let me take the chainsaw to many of these trees to reopen the views. This is a plan for a fountain. There's a natural spring here, and this is the original drawing. And this is before restoration. I don't have a photograph of this fountain restored, but this drawing was used to completely restore this this garden feature. This was a very mysterious stone that we found that in the end was actually a lamppost. This is a fountain. This is the greenhouse that we saw earlier. That's what that greenhouse had fallen into decay and was completely rebuilt using the original architectural drawings. Another one of the grottos. That the garden has a big network of navigable roads. Carvalho Monteiro was one of the first people in Sintra to own a car, but there's also a network of pedestrian, small scale, all up the hillside. And then there are all these subterranean caves. This is the entrance to one of them. And Manini, as I said, was a set designer, and his garden at Regaleira is very closely linked and inspired by his stage designs. And here we see some of the interiors. And these were the two museum catalogues that were published, one in Italy, one in Portugal, based on this research from the archives in the garden. Now I've got a short period to show you Queluz. Queluz, as again a garden I've worked in since the 1980s. It was previously a royal palace. It's now the National Palace of Queluz. It belongs to Parques de Sintra. It's open to tourism, but it's still used for state events as well. the gardens had been incredibly neglected and somewhat badly handled. And since the time when it passed to the Parques de Sintra, we initiated a research program to begin to put it back. But it's a very big garden. There are 18 kilometers of box hedges, for instance. It dates back to the 17th century. This is a painting from Italy. And this man, whose house it was on the wrong side of the, when the Spanish kings, there are 3 generations of Spanish kings who were finally removed by the Portuguese in 1640. And this man was on the Spanish side. So the crown what do we have? Took it away. Sometimes my English fails. It was confiscated by the crown and became part of the royal palaces. And this was Queen Maria, who, because of this business with the Spanish kings inheriting the Spanish throne, to avoid that, she married her uncle, King Pedro III. And that's the Braganza family that are still today the pretenders to the Portuguese throne now. This, because it's a royal palace, has a vast archive, and it's all ended up in various different places, but mostly in the National Archives of Torre do Tombo. But it's like looking for a needle in a haystack. And this drawing is very interesting because it shows when the garden was first being built, and they're sending 107 bundles containing 420 trees, and then 300 yew pyramids, and another 100 which I can't remember what they are. But there were also box hedges being sent by ship. So this is a bill of shipping. And here we are. This is the translation of what I could. The last part is 100 unclipped. So there were 300 pyramids and 100 unclipped yews being sent down by these rather precarious-looking boats from Holland. The garden, Queluz Garden, has a fabulous collection of lead statues, and there's a man called John Cheer who produced reproductions of classical statues in lead, which are now highly sought after collector's items. And Queluz has the world's largest collection in situ. There's one of them. They've all been beautifully restored. And this is an old picture of one of the parterres, which we did a lot of research, archaeological research, dendrochronological research, archival research, and we reinstated the original pattern that you'll see towards the end of this presentation. You can see that the palace is looking pretty poor state. The windows and the painting and the roof are all that's a new roof there. That's my 45-minute reminder. So I'll be nearly there. Okay, this is the parterre as it had reached us in the late 20th century. And this is a reconstruction of the original plan that was in the National Library of Brazil, Rio de Janeiro. It was found by one of the directors of Queluz. And that's a small detail from this is the garden we were looking at. There's another bigger parterre at the side. The parterres were full of flowers and descriptions of the flowers. The king spent 600 or 700 cruzades per year, which is an awful lot of money. So they were planting about 10,000 bulbs a year in the in these parterres. This is the collection of lead statues that are laid out throughout the garden. And this is the state the garden had arrived in 2004. It was really in pretty poor shape, and it's been a tremendous amount of work to get it back to shape. As I say, there are 18 kilometers of box hedging, with all the problems that box has at the moment. This is beginning to, the water system wasn't working, the pruning wasn't right, and everything needed to be put right. And it was all based on this historical research from the archives. One of the most exciting finds we had was this survey drawing of the facade. And as you see, if I go back, this here is yellow, but some of it was pink, and different. Every time somebody did some restoration, they painted a different color. And from a microscopic examination of this drawing, we were actually able to reconstruct the original painting scheme. And this is what it looks like today. You can see here a detailed drawing. And we found even some vestiges. You see the blue color here. Interesting enough, houses in Portugal go through color fashions, and because of the Queluz project, now everybody is painting their historic houses blue. This is what it looked like before, a pink, and this is what it was, the original color. There was another area that had been really badly treated, was the Botanic Garden, the Royal Botanic Garden of Queluz from the 1790s. It had been flooded in the 1980s and removed, and they decided that it would be a great place to make a riding school for horses. So that was completely destroyed. It was reinstated. We had military engineer surveys from 19th century, very, very accurate. We had the archaeologists investigating the underground evidence. We had the architectural drawings for the greenhouses. We had a list written of the plant collection by the doctor of the Queen in the 18th century, who unfortunately was considered mad. So she shared the same medic as George III of England. And anyway, so we made what is something very, very rare in garden conservation. This is considered to be a reconstruction. We used the original stones, the original statues that had all been taken away, and we found them dumped in the olive groves, and we brought them all back and put it all back in the right place. And now you can see the garden is still quite young, but it's growing. This fountain we found in the basement underneath the palace. These stones were tucked under box hedges, completely abandoned. These were elsewhere in the garden, and because we had so much documented evidence, we were able to put it back in exactly the same place. And I think because of the documental research, this very small garden was given a very big prize, which is the EuropaNostra, which is the top conservation prize from the European Union. And this is the other garden that I was showing you with the big cypress trees. Has just been replanted. These statues this is their original placement, but they came from somewhere else. They were from elsewhere in the garden. The box hedges were replaced with myrtle because of the disease problems. Interesting enough, in the 18th century, the hedges were described as myrtle, but unfortunately in Portuguese gardeners' terminology, myrtle and box are more or less interchangeable. And so now I think I'm getting to the end. This is a book I wrote on the gardens of Queluz with two other authors, all based on the historic research. These are some of my photographs that are in the book, and that's all, folks. So thank you very much. I think Angela will rescue me now.
Thank you so much, Gerald. If you'd like to unshare, perhaps we can go back to gallery view.
Okay, so let me see if I can get this right.
We all come into focus.
Is that good now?
Yes, I can see
Okay.
everybody on my an amazing amount of detective work and painstaking detail, a lot of desk work actually, to and these very different gardens.
Yes, it's it's not a normal combination of the practical work with the academic investigation, and I can tell you some of it is incredibly tedious and boring. You have to spend weeks sometimes in archives. At the National Archives of Queluz, there are literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of boxes.
Yeah.
And you have to ask for them one at a time. And they bring you a box and you open it and you've no idea what's going to be in it. And then fortunately, unlike the Monini archives, they were numbered. So once you found it, you could sort of write down the coordinates and you'd be able to get back to it again. The Monini stuff was just a pile of paper.
So you didn't talk about exactly, so let's take that last Queluz. So how many was it a year? How long did that archival work take? And then how long did the physical work take?
Yeah, well, the archival work probably not as long as Monini. Monini was 7 years. Queluz was maybe 3 or 4 years. Actually, I spent the first 2 years of my doctorate working on, which was on Monserrate, working on Queluz. So I had to hurry up to finish my Monserrate doctorate. So.
And so then when they had determined that the design and so on, how long then to bring it back to?
Well, the most complicated thing was we're dealing with national monuments, and so the bureaucracy involved is horrendous. And there's like a tribunal of 23 different professors that when you make a serious intervention, like digging up the parterre that's 250 years old and replacing it, it has to be signed off by this tribunal, those tribunals, 23 people, this committee, if you like. And so obviously that takes time, yes.
But all hands off to them that they have actually, put the resources in. And...
Yeah, well, we had a remarkable director of Parques de Sintra for 7 years, Professor Antonio Lemos, who he was incredibly influential, incredibly dynamic. He managed to raise money, he managed to put things together again, and he managed to persuade all these other professors what needed doing. And any amount of research wouldn't have made any difference at all if it hadn't been for him, organizing the whole organization.
Fantastic. Okay, so I've got one lady, Carol Bornstein, hello, has raised her hand to ask a question.
Thank you. Fabulous presentation. I learned so much. I'm curious, the last garden was described as a botanic garden, and the collections at Monserrate are very extensive. Is there documentation for these gardens, databases of the plantings that you're keeping track of what you have and where it is?
Yeah, I assembled right from the beginning for Monserrate. I had to assemble the list there's no one sort of archive that told me what was being grown at Monserrate. So every time somebody visited the garden, they'd write a description, and I would compile lists and lists and lists of not only the plants, but where they were being grown and at what time, and identifying their archaic names to modern botanic names. So all of that was informing the new planting. At Queluz, the only list we had was for the Botanic Garden is just a very small area of Queluz, and it was planted by the physicians, the Queen's physicians, for medical purposes. And what it did say in this list is that it was organized according to Linnean principles. And when we studied the maps, we discovered that there were 22 beds, and that's how many classes Linnaeus had in his plant classification. And so I think it's probably the only 21st century botanical garden that has been planted according to the theories of Linnaeus. So as a fellow of the Linnean Society, I'm very pleased about that.
Are there labels, plant labels in any of these gardens?
Monserrate, deliberately no. In the Queluz, yes, the Botanic Garden is all labeled. Yes, we didn't want the Monserrate to lose its magic of a romantic garden and be full of labels and signs.
Mm-hmm. Understood. Thank you.
Angela, you're muted.
Keep myself. If you were to want to visit these three,
Yes.
What times? How would you give a day each, or how would it work?
Well, you know, I often accompany and guide specialist garden tours, and unfortunately, they always want to see all three gardens
In a day.
Well, it actually. No, Queluz usually gets separated because it's quite a long way away. But I've just had a group very recently, and there's another garden where we like to go for lunch, and so we do Regaleira first, then a lunch, and then Monserrate afterwards. But there's one problem we're having at the moment is Regaleira has become way too successful, and it at this time of the year is getting 3,000 to 4,000 visitors a day, but in the summer it can get from 8,000 to 10,000, and it's a small garden, and it looks like the people arriving at the garden look as if they've just come off the metro. You know, they fill the street. So you have to be very careful when you decide to visit Regaleira. Very, very early in the morning, very late in the evening, and preferably not in the summer. So Monserrate is fine. Monserrate is far enough away from the center of Sintra, which gets millions and millions of tourists. So Monserrate maybe gets 200,000 a year or something like that, and is so big that it can absorb everybody.
And they also just go to the cafe, as you said. So.
As I said, they go and see the house and the cafe. Yes.
Okay, so I've got two people with. I'll take Sarah Dunstaville. Hello, hi.
Hello.
I have a very naive question. When you were speaking about when you were introducing Monserrate, you said, of course, it's not a park; it's a series of gardens.
Yes.
For me, I'm not sure when something stops being a park and becomes a series of gardens, or when a series of gardens are not a park.
It's really a question of planting style, and,
Okay.
Gardens are intimate and intricate in many ways. At least this style of planting of Monserrate. You know, you've got the fern collection, you've got the Mexican collection, the rose garden. Whereas a park. We have a splendid example of a park in Sintra, is the Penna Park, that is something like 400 hectares. And it's more like the Arboretum. It's a much greater scale. And even that has gardens within it as well. So it has, they have other tree fern valleys and so on.
And
it's
then
maybe pedantic.
I think it's very interesting because there is this notion of intimacy, but can a park be made up of a series of gardens plus a park as in Penna?
Yes, I think, but a park has by definition really has to be quite extensive.
Okay.
And mostly trees. I think. I mean, if you know, a classic example in London, Richmond Park or something, all the royal parks. They were very often hunting parks originally. It's a question of horticultural intensity, I think, is the difference.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sorry, I keep muting myself. Hi, Rick. Yes, thank you. Sorry.
Yes, thank you, Angela. That was an incredible presentation, Gerald. I really loved it.
Thank you.
My wife and I had the good fortune to visit in 2006 during our first trip to Portugal, the first two gardens that you presented today, Regaleira and Monserrate.
Yes.
Monserrate was an incredible garden in 2006, but I can see that it's worth a return visit because you have really evolved it in the subsequent years. That was, I guess, about 4 years before the Mexican garden opened.
Yes, we really got going in about 2008. But I'd been working on it a lot in the 90s, and then there was a bit of a break. That's why I moved to Regaleira, because the politics at Monserrate weren't in the right place.
Yes,
and so
when we go ahead,
then Monserrate in the year 2000 was one of the founders of the Parques de Sintra. But the first administration of the Parques de Sintra were very much nature conservation oriented and not garden oriented. And Monserrate was not very high on their agenda. And it was only in about 2006, so maybe 2005, that the administration changed, and Professor Lamas became president, and he had been head of Portuguese heritage, and I used to work for him in the 90s, and so he had me come back again, but there were lots of financial problems in the beginning, and so they weren't really in any shape to take on major restoration projects until about 2008, and then from then onwards to right through to 2015, then we were restoring many gardens, not just Monserrate. It's a big organization.
Yes, when we arrived in Sintra for an overnight stay in 2006, on our itinerary was to visit the Sintra Palace and Monserrate primarily, and that ruined castle on the hilltop. And that night at dinner in a cafe in downtown Sintra, the waiter told us about Quinta de Regaleira and that garden, and that's why we added it to our itinerary the following day. And to this day, it's I think without it, it's the most incredible garden I've ever visited in the world. It is just, it's remarkable. And Unfortunately, that was before it became popular, I guess, through social media and other means. It wasn't crowded back in 2006, like apparently it is today.
No, it's. I mean, I started doing major restoration in 2000, and really, you know, we had the garden to ourselves. It was when these exhibitions that we did, that started to really generate a lot more interest. Also, you know, there are, as I mentioned, many books have been written with incredible theories about Freemasons in the garden that just appeals. It has a completely different demographic. All the people that visit Monserrate are probably under 40, and not sorry, Regaleira under 40, and Monserrate over 60. It's,
can I just ask one more question, then I'll yield the floor. I understand you have been involved with some gardens on Madeira as well.
Yes, yes.
I'd love to have Angela get you back for a return visit to do a presentation on them, because there are some incredible gardens there.
It is. A large part of my business is in Madeira, and the gardens I've made are mostly for hotels. But I've worked closely with Adam and Christina Blandi. You must have heard of the Blandi Gardens at Palheiro. They're amazing. I wrote a book on the gardens of Madeira. You might be able to find it on Amazon.
I shall look for it.
It's getting scarce, but unfortunately it has not been republished.
There's a small cactus and succulent garden in Funchal, at the edge of Funchal, overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. And it's next to something called the Magic Tea House. And to visit the garden in 2010, you had to go in and buy a drink, and then through the back door of the cafe, you could access the garden. And pound for pound, I think that was one of the greatest cactus and succulent gardens I've ever seen. Did you have any involvement with
I'm embarrassed to say that, yes, I built that garden and designed it, yes.
I kind of surmised that you might have had your fingerprints on that.
It used to be the town dump.
Well, I hope it looks as great today as it did in 2010.
Well, it's because they don't open it to the public on a proper basis, it doesn't get the maintenance funding. But I use some of my resources from other gardens to keep it going. So
can you give us the name of that garden, please? Because I don't.
Well, it's known as Madeira Magic. It was intended as a children's theme park. Only my client was the owner of a 5-star hotel next door to it, and so he persuaded the local municipality that instead of a children's theme park, maybe they'd let him make a cactus garden, and he'd get Luckhurst to do it for him. So that's what we did. So.
Fantastic. Okay, so I've got 2 people waiting for questions. Sean, and then Tazia, I can see you. So, but Sean first. Hi, Sean.
Hi. Just a quick question about the crowding in at least the one of these gardens. Are these many gardens in Europe? You have to buy a ticket that's timed and things like that, and it's actually kind of difficult. You have to do it way in advance and things like that. Is that happening here in Portugal?
It's happening in the Palace of Pena. On the top of the mountain, there's another royal palace, which is the one with the park I was just talking about. You won't need a ticket. You won't need a time ticket to visit the park, but if you want to visit the house or the palace, they're very strict. Unfortunately, Regaleira desperately needs something like that. They can't possibly deal with 10,000 visitors a day, but they do.
Yeah,
And
that
so
would
there's
put
no,
me off.
it's a free for all. Yes.
I don't like crowded.
No,
I don't
no,
like crowds in general, but certainly not a crowded garden. But
no,
you can
no, it's
appreciate
terrible.
it.
And whenever I'm with visiting groups, I always try and say to them, you know, we really shouldn't do Regaleira anymore, but because it has such an appeal, we always end up doing it. But this last trip, I said, okay, we'll do it, but I'm only going to do the bottom half when nobody goes, and you can look at the other half in on the internet. It's like going down the stairs to go into the London Underground. You know, it's all these. The garden is full of tunnels and staircases and so on, and it's got a one-way system, and it's the wrong way around. There's the Freemasons think that you should descend into to hell to do your dark initiations, and the Catholic owner would have gone the other way, and he would have come from the entrails of from the darkness and risen into the light, and you don't do that anymore. So
so there's some yeah, they need some management. Just on this quick before we go to
well, you can imagine, you know, if they've got 10,000 visitors, they're making over 100,000 euros a day from their entrance fees. You know. There aren't many gardens in the world that can do that. And maybe the Alhambra.
Okay, Tasia, and I think that will be our last question, if that's okay with people. Yes, can you unmute yourself, Tasia?
Yeah, I have a practical question. I mean, the gardens are magnificent, something that we humble mortals will never have. But it looks like the gardens are grown that way. But I know that gardens need a lot of care. How do you keep it looking so neat? How do you get between all those crowded areas and the plants look perfect? That doesn't happen by themselves.
I think the phrase nowadays is right plant, right place. Actually, I don't like neat and tidy gardens. I like things to have their own way, and I really find that gardens with too much money and too many gardeners are not as interesting as places that can be where the gardener is stretched to the limits to maintain the gardens. It's really a question of you know, when you're selecting the plants, getting the competition between them right, and the plants sort of occupy their own space and prevent the other plants from taking over the garden. Of course, occasionally you have a few thugs like that Himalayan hedychium, but again, if you give it a space that's adequate to its means, it'll stay there and it won't go there. It won't go elsewhere because it's too dry.
Nevertheless, Gerald, I mean, they're presumably how many? I mean, let's talk staff. I mean,
well, Monserrate has had periods when it only has 4 gardeners. There have been times, obviously, when there are a lot of people there working and rebuilding the garden. I think the comfortable number at Monserrate is around 6 or 7, and then and we're talking 75 acres. So
yeah, big.
So they need to be well equipped. They need to be very well motivated, and there's some areas like weeding Mexico in the spring is like painting the 4th Road Bridge. You know, you start at one end, and by the time you get to the other end, the weeds are grown. But it's a seasonal thing, and when the heat comes, the garden goes to sleep. So actually, the least busy period of the garden is from June, July, August.
The large agave and things. I always get little babies in them. How do you keep them just one big plant like that?
It depends on, there are different types of agaves. And some of them, like the common one, agave americana, produce great numbers of suckers. But others don't produce any suckers at all. At Trevirans, for instance, we have to wait for it to flower. It produces plantlets on the stem. And then there are others like Franzosini. We just wish it would produce more settings because we could take them off and make new plants. So you have to know your plants, and we plant a lot of things that I don't know. I've always been an experimenter, and sometimes you make mistakes, but that's the way you learn. And then next time you know how to deal with it. That's,
well, I think that on that level, I mean, yes, we're all learning all the time, and I think that's a good point, a good place for us to end. Thanking you.
It's been a great pleasure
sharing these beautiful gardens with us, and I hope that you will continue to join us in our other sessions.
Yes, it's been fun. Sophie and I, we've enjoyed looking in. So.
Okay, so thank you everybody for joining. We will go back to practical a practical session next month, which is I'm very happy that Peter Korn has agreed to talk about growing in sand. If you all recall the Tom Stuart Smith presentation, he was very referred to Peter and how that has helped him in the UK add diversity to the plantings. And I think we were all slightly confused about the actual mechanics of that process.
Well, so, can I just add something?
Yes, absolutely.
Because of the Stuart Smith presentation, I went back to using bare root planting, which I haven't done for donkey's years. Right. And I found a supplier in Holland who sent me pallets and pallets of bare root plants, very cheap. And there's really is something in it. And I understand that Peter Korn does everything bare root in his sand gardens.
Well,
so
let's get together next.
I'm looking forward to that presentation.
Fantastic. Okay, thanks everybody. See you next month. Take care. Thank you, Gerald, again. Cheers.
Thank you. Okay.
Bye.
Can I sign out now? Yes.
Yeah, I'm going to end the meeting.
Okay.
Bye,
Goodbye.
Bye. Bye.